JEM Publishing presents the unabridged recording of Rescuing Melissa, The Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1, written by Ellie Masters, narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes. 26. Only If. Melissa. Melissa woke up in a cold sweat. Blood-drenched tulips flitted through her mind, the tangled threads of dreams she didn't want to remember. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Darkness filled the room, and she bolted upright only to gasp against a sharp pain cutting through her side. Memories returned in a flash of agony. The tornado, CJ, the hospital, surgery, and finally her home and a field of tulips stained by death. She wrapped her arms around herself and rocked in bed, crying in the darkness. Scott was out there. When he found her, would he kill her? Or did he have other plans for his wife? There was no sound in the room except her quiet sobs. It looked like CJ left her to sleep. She was grateful for that small courtesy. Privacy seemed to be something she could not guarantee around that man. For a stranger, he certainly inserted himself into her life. Was he still out there, or had he left? Her gut seized with fear. She didn't want to be alone. If Scott discovered where she was, she'd be in no condition to fight. A rustling came from the other room, and she tensed.
Melissa?
CJ's deep voice resonated deep within her core, striking at something buried deep and long forgotten. A sigh of relief whispered past her lips. He hadn't abandoned her. The longer CJ stayed around, the more of herself she lost in his charms. Such the perfect gentleman. Stupid, gallant hero. She hated him for being so perfect. Careful not to pull her tortured muscles, she twisted and gave the pillow a long, hard stare. As welcoming as the soft down appeared, she wanted nothing to do with the dreams it promised. A glance at the clock showed her it was 2 a.m. She should be asleep. Her body needed to rest to heal. That damn dream, like Scott, had spoiled everything. The darkness clawed at her, reminding her of evil things lurking in the world. She turned on the light next to the bed. The door hinges squeaked.
You awake?
Yes.
Can't you sleep?
No. CJ stepped into the soft illumination spilling from the doorway, his features silhouetted until he moved into the cone of light beside her bed. Her breath hitched in her throat, rendering her speechless as she gazed into the soul of an angel. He sat on the corner of the bed, tugging at the edges of a white robe. She wanted to touch him. Instead, she kept her arms wrapped around her waist, giving herself a lonely hug.
You should try to get some rest,
he encouraged, moving closer. She shrugged. I had a bad dream. He brushed the hair off her forehead.
What was your dream about?
A nightmare? She scooted back. I feel better now, thank you for... An awkward pause hung between them. His presence electrified her. When he wasn't beside her, she could convince herself she could resist him, that his magnetic pull wasn't that strong. But when he was close, all her defenses crumbled. This undeniable need surged strong and powerful within her body, and perhaps even her heart. Scott had never had this effect on her. How did CJ make her feel so alive? Or was she that desperate for affection?
You don't look better.
A grin spread across his face, softening the strength of his jawline. Your compliments need work, she teased, forcing a smile of her own, but she wasn't ready to join him in laughter.
Sorry, but why didn't you tell me you were in that much pain?
She shrugged. What was I going to say? I hate hospitals. They keep the lights on all night, and the staff talks the whole time. All I wanted was to go home and get some rest where I could heal. The smile on his face faded.
I can only imagine if you had taken that cab. You would have been alone.
Do you think he was at the house? His pause made her heart skip a beat. Did you see him? He shook his head.
I didn't.
Did Mac or Jenny? CJ scooted until he was sitting beside her. He took her hand in his.
Mac thought he might have seen movement at the edge of the property, but we can't know for sure. Your ex took a huge risk going there.
Because of the manhunt? She sat a little straighter. Wouldn't my house have been under surveillance? How did no one see anything?
All the damage from the storm has complicated things. Electricity is still out in some parts of town. Most of the police have been diverted to assist in recovery. No one was watching your house, and I'm pretty certain he was waiting for you.
Her heart did one of those free-fall things where the bottom dropped out and sent her on a plunge into oblivion. She hunched over as a wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her. Scott had been waiting. He was patient and jealous as hell. What if he saw her with CJ? CJ enveloped her in warmth with one of his healing hugs, a promise that he would protect her from the world. She blinked back hot tears, unwilling to show another moment of weakness in front of this man who had shown so much kindness. His fingers tangled in her hair, straightening out the mess. His soft lips pressed against her forehead, and she wished his tender kiss could make all the evil in the world disappear, but that would be hoping for too much. I appreciate everything you've done. I really do. An errant tear trickled down her cheek. She brushed at it with irritation. I don't know how to thank you, but tomorrow I'll figure out how to pay for a security detail. I know you're busy. She watched him, hoping he would take this way out and extricate himself from the mess that was her life. Instead, he cupped her chin. His baby blues stared at her with such intensity that they burned her from the inside out. He leaned close, his gaze never once leaving hers.
I didn't come to the hospital because of a stupid phone. I came to see you.
Her breath hitched as he leaned in and brushed his lips against hers. Heat seared her mouth and burned deep to her core. When he deepened the kiss, she couldn't think of anything except to kiss him back. He paused, pulled away, and broke the spell. They stared at each other, the air crackling with promise, but filled with the weight of her ex-husband's presence.
I'm here because I want to be.
He pressed his finger to her lips when she tried to speak.
You need rest, and in the morning you and I need to discuss a few things.
He exited the room, leaving the door open a crack. Her fingers brushed her lips. She tasted him, rich and sultry. Had the kiss been a dream? Or more of a promise?
27. White silk. CJ. CJ shouldn't have gone for the kiss. He stormed off to the other end of the hotel suite, shaking out his hands. Shit. There was still so much they needed to talk about before he confused things with kisses, because there definitely would be more. But how to broach the connection with his sister? He stopped at the large picture window and yanked back the curtains to stare at the city lights. Street lamps paraded off into the darkness, silent soldiers guarding the night. A clock tower squatted over the town square, keeping time. And off in the distance, floodlights bathed a deserted shopping center in artificial daylight until the return of shoppers the next day. A few headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating safe passage for the people inside. There were a few areas blanketed by dark, those parts of town where power had yet to be restored. Despite that, the city breathed with a subdued vitality. Hidden between all the light, lurking in the shadows, a killer walked the streets. What would Patterson's timeline be this time around? Would one death satisfy his need for desecration? Or was he even now brushing against innocent lives, choosing his next victim? CJ wished he was out hunting, doing what he was trained to do, rather than guarding a woman who tangled his thoughts and had him thinking of nothing other than getting her into his bed. The trip to this small town wasn't anything he'd imagined it would be. He'd planned to close off a chapter of his life, witness an execution, and place a flower on his sister's grave. It was supposed to be over. Instead, his sister's murderer was killing again. That was one hell of a detour. He didn't need the additional burden of a woman. Eventually, he'd have to tell her about the link which joined them. There was no easy way to address the small detail of Patterson's rape, torture, and murder of his baby sister. He desperately needed to talk to Melissa before things went any further. He massaged the corded muscles of his neck, trying to relieve some of the tension building there.
CJ?
He spun at the softness of Melissa's voice. Time to deal with the damage of that kiss. Melissa, A silk nightgown draped her slim form, covering her body but hiding none of the details of what lay beneath. His mouth went dry, taken in by her beauty. When she took a step toward him, the fabric of the camisole shifted. He couldn't help but stare at her perfection. With great effort, he lifted his gaze and met her troubled expression. "You should be sleeping." The caution of her movements was painful to watch. After seeing the extent of bruising on her body, he was amazed she was even on her feet.
I can't sleep.
He took an involuntary step back, but ran up against the press of the window. The need to run was as palpable as the need to take her. Caught between two warring desires, he found himself paralyzed, afraid even to breathe. Her eyes closed, and she breathed out a long, deep sigh as if steeling herself for a difficult task. Her lids flicked open and revealed her determination, pinning him in place. She ran a finger along her lower lip, tracing the curve of her mouth.
You kissed me.
Her brows knitted together, confusion forming a deep furrow. He wanted to kiss her pain away. "Melissa." She held up a hand.
You said you didn't come to the hospital to bring back my phone. What did you mean by that?
His gaze darted between her eyes and the curve of her lips, trying to gauge her state of mind, but he came up empty-handed. She took a few steps, but turned away before she got too close. Her nightgown's white silk hugged the curve of her ass and swished between her long, lean legs. He checked his robe, making sure it was closed, and tightened the knot at his waist. Nothing was poking out that shouldn't be, but he'd feel much more comfortable if he were dressed.
Why did you kiss me, then leave?
Because you need to rest. Because if I stayed, I wouldn't have stopped at a kiss.
But in the shower, the way you... so brisk and businesslike. Like a chore.
A tear trickled down her cheek.
I've never felt so ugly. Why would you kiss me if you felt that way?
Anguish filled her words. She wrapped herself in her arms, a gesture she did when she felt insecure, like she'd become accustomed to being the only person who provided her comfort. He moved. His powerful legs devoured the distance between them, while his mind replayed her words. I've never felt so ugly. He did that. He went to her, but she stepped away, holding out a hand to halt his advance.
I thought you were teasing about the drowned rat comment. It seemed innocent and funny, but you keep saying things like that. I never thought anyone could be so cruel.
He approached, but her upraised hand stopped him in his tracks. She scrubbed at her cheeks.
I get who I am, and my life's a mess.
She fisted her tiny hands and stiffened her spine.
I'm not asking for anything, but please stop toying with me.
Oh, hell, this was worse than he imagined. How had he messed things up so badly for her to believe such horrible things? Professionally and personally, he was taking advantage of her vulnerability, but he no longer cared. He needed to feel her lips and taste her sweet mouth. She needed to know how he felt. That's not what I think at all.
Then why?
He grabbed her waist and pulled her against him, sweeping down to claim her quivering lips before she could react and pull away. As his mouth brushed against hers, she gasped and placed a hand against his chest, but she didn't push him away. Her fingers curled in the fabric of the robe. He deepened the kiss, daring to taste her tempting mouth. And while he closed his eyes, he tightened his grip around her waist, trying to be gentle with her, bruising yet desperate to cleave her to him. She tilted her face back, the soft touch of her lips raising the hairs on the back of his neck. His cock tightened, fully aroused now, and a tingle of electricity surged through him. He slowed down the kiss, taking time to explore, teasing her to open to him and tangle her tongue with his. She moaned as he claimed what he wanted, and then he broke the kiss, not to release her, but to pull her close and allow her to feel the full force of his arousal pressed between them. He placed a finger under her chin. That shower was the hardest thing I've endured in a very long time. I kissed you, but I want to do so much more. I didn't want to take advantage of you. She gasped. You've had a long day, and the last thing I wanted was to make things more difficult. You needed help, and I was trying to help, not push myself on you. I'm sorry if I made you feel ugly.
It felt like you were washing a dog. My nurse touched me with more interest than you, and I'm pretty sure he's gay.
He laughed. Have you seen yourself in a mirror? Drowned rat, baggy pants, and you can barely move. You fell in the shower because you had no right taking one alone. A bath would have been a better choice. The corner of her lip turned up.
I didn't think I could fold my body into that tub.
Well, what did you think I would do in that shower?
I don't know, but did it ever occur to you to cop a feel, give a girl some hope?
He threw his head back, releasing a deep belly of laughter. Now, that had not been what he'd expected her to say. Cop a feel? Did you really just say that? And you could have done the same thing.
What?
Cop a feel? Can't you feel how much I want you? It was a struggle to remain a gentleman around this woman. He gave her a quick once-over. Do you even know how gorgeous you are? He gripped her upper arms, settling on the safest place on her body to touch. Grabbing her waist would ensure one of two things. Either he'd cop a feel of her ass, or pull her against his hardened cock. A little friction. He shook his head. She was his assignment, a woman to protect, not fuck. But damn if he did want to do just that.
Honestly, I felt like I was getting a sponge bath by a nun.
A nun? Had she compared him to a celibate woman? To hell with Sam and protocol and screw touching only her arms. He cupped the soft swell of her breast. Is this something a nun would do? She bit her lower lip, and couldn't have given a more perfect answer. Sometimes life gave something amazing. He kissed her nose while his fingers traced the tight bead of her nipple until it pebbled beneath the silk of her nightgown. She reached between them and released the belt of his robe. Her fingers skimmed his muscles, her fingertips tracing each ridge. He held himself perfectly still, unable to stop her exploration and unwilling to try. She stared down at the full length of him, and a sly smile spread across her face, erasing that deep furrow over her forehead.
You're most definitely not a nun.
He gasped as she gripped him, gliding her fingers up and down his cock. He dug his fingers into her shoulders while she curled hers around his shaft and stroked him root to crown. The path she traced sent bolts of electricity crackling along her nerves. This was not the direction he'd expected this conversation to go. Still, she seemed determined, and he was more than willing to oblige her hunger. Melissa, he rocked forward with a groan. I hope you're not teasing me because... There was a twinkle in her eye.
How do I look to you now? None. Do you see a drowned rat? Or was it a fried rat?
He rocked back on his heels while she stroked him. A groan escaped his lips despite his best intentions to remain silent. You look like the woman I'm going to fuck. Don't start something you don't intend to finish because I'm warning you I'm the farthest thing from a nun. He tried to capture her in one of his roguish gazes, but found himself unprepared for the desire shining in her eyes. She placed a finger on his nose and gave a squeeze of his dick.
That's what I'm hoping for.
The glide of her hand up and down his shaft wasn't light or tentative.
Is this okay?
Okay. The gasp escaping his lips as she stroked him sounded needy even to his ears. Not the picture of the dominant man he wanted to portray. It's definitely okay. I have to tell you, I've been trying to be the perfect gentleman since the day you launched yourself at me. It's been very hard not to take what I want. It was time to turn the tables and take back control.
Take what you want. You do want me?
She sounded hesitant and unsure, even with her hand all over his dick. Yes. Does my hard cock in your hand feel like a man who doesn't want you?
Even knowing who I am?
What does that mean?
You know,
He placed his finger over her lips. All I need from you is to hear whether you want to continue this. Because if that's a yes, this ends only one way. And that's with me buried balls deep inside of you. Seeing as how your hand is on my dick, I'm taking that as a yes. But I don't play around when it comes to sex. I want you. I haven't been able to think about anything but you since we met. However, I won't take advantage of this situation, and I most definitely won't take advantage of you. He grabbed her ass, pulling her against his cock, then cupped her chin. His thumb rested at the corner of her mouth, and he dragged a finger across the curve of her lips, then breached them, pressing his thumb inside her mouth. She curled her lips around his thumb, her tongue circling the tip in a sensuous promise of something more. Her lips were soft, whereas the velvet of her tongue had him groaning and his cock jumping. What would her tongue feel like on his cock? So what's it gonna be? She let out the tiniest of whimpers, and her gaze locked onto his with a look of desperation matching the need rising within him. She gave a slow lick, then released his thumb from the wonder of her mouth.
I want you to take advantage of me.
She gave a soft laugh.
I haven't felt anything like this in my life. Is it wrong to say that?
Not at all. But are you sure this is what you want? To be with me? He picked his words carefully. If she needed only this one night, he'd give it to her. But he hoped this was more of a beginning than a one-night stand.
I do.
Her hand brushed against his cock, and her delicate fingers danced along his shaft. Leaning in, he touched his lips to hers. Just a slow, tender lick before taking more. The contact detonated a spark between them. Fuck, there's no turning back now. I want you so damn much. His words came out in a furious growl. She threw her arms around his neck, pressing her body against his. His hands gripped harder, mindless of her injuries. He lifted her off her feet and carried her into the bedroom. Nothing but silk separated his hands from her body, something he would soon remedy. He needed to feel the heat of her skin against his body. Her mouth broke away, her head dropping with a sigh against his shoulder.
CJ,
She breathed.
I want you too.
Slowly, he lowered her onto the bed, bending down to suck on the tender skin of her ear. His hand slipped to rest on her belly, grabbing at the fabric of her nightgown. He sought her softest parts, tracing the curve of her breasts with his fingers and walking a path down her belly to swirl around her navel before heading lower still. She pulled him down, arching her neck to encourage him. He obliged, licking and tasting from her earlobe down to the corner of her jaw, seeking the warm heat of her mouth while his hand explored. He was desperate to taste every inch of her body. The nightgown needed to go. He found the hem and slipped his fingers beneath the silky fabric. She wriggled her hips, lifting so that he could uncover the expanse of her creamy skin to his aching eyes. Their eyes locked as he moved the bunched fabric over the swell of her breast, exposing her fully to his determined gaze. Time slowed down as she slipped her arms out of the spaghetti straps and let him pull the fabric over her head. She lay before him, naked except for the small triangle of fabric covering her pussy. That would come off next. Her arousal filled the air and slammed into him with a heady intoxication he would soon devour. God, he murmured, I've wanted to do this since the day we met. Her low laugh had him smiling.
Why didn't you?
He slapped the side of her ass playfully. Because I'm not the kind of guy who takes advantage of an injured woman. She looked at him with hooded eyes.
What kind of man are you then?
He was a hunter. A boy who'd killed to save his mother. A man who saved strangers. I definitely don't deserve you. He divested himself of his robe, his cock bobbing in the air, eager and ready. But he wouldn't rush this moment. She was a feast he intended to savor.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Well, I'm the kind of man who'll make a drowned rat scream. A smile tilted the corner of his mouth.
We need to discuss your pillow talk.
Her lips pushed out into a pout. How about this, then? He brushed a strand of hair away from her face. I want to fuck you until you lose your voice from screaming, until you can't even remember your name. You won't be able to walk for days, and I'll be in you so deep you'll never forget I was there. And every time you open your mouth, it'll be to beg me to take you again. Her mouth parted and her chest heaved.
Oh my.
The soft pink tip of her tongue rested on her bottom lip. Then her mouth widened.
That was good.
Good?
Very.
He devoured her, sweeping his tongue inside her eager mouth, claiming her for the night. His hands wrapped around her waist, his fingers curling under the small scrap of fabric of her panties. Slowly he pulled it over her hips and down her thighs, enjoying the delicious reveal. He tossed her panties on the ground. Taking his time, he kissed her chin, then nibbled the soft spot where her neck joined her shoulder. His lips brushed over her nipples, which peaked with arousal. Moving with care, he kissed the worst of her bruising, tracing the angry lines of purple and red with his tongue, trying to determine how sensitive she might be. It would be too easy to hurt her, and his need demanded something rough and raw. He'd be soft and gentle if he had to, but he preferred a harder edge. She didn't flinch against his touch. Her fingers curled in his hair, tentative and unsure as he moved between her legs. He positioned himself between the smoothness of her thighs, inhaling her rich beauty and glancing up to catch her eyes. She released him and pressed her hands to the sides of her head, giving a soft moan and wriggling her hips beneath his hands. He pressed a kiss to her mound, then another to the apex of her thigh. His fingers brushed her with gentle strokes, increasing the pressure and moving closer to her core. Then he feathered his kisses, his tongue driving against her tender nub until she bucked beneath him. He wanted hard and fast, but needed to make sure she could handle what he had to give. Tracing the seam of her pussy, he licked and kissed until she shuddered beneath him, melting back into the bed. He slid his fingers against her thigh, then pressed one inside her cleft. She groaned in pleasure, her legs opening for him. He sucked her clit into his mouth, stroking her as he slipped another finger inside her channel. A strangled sound tore from her throat, her hips bucking beneath his mouth. He pumped his fingers in and out, feeling her walls clench around his knuckles. A shudder hit her body as he thrust his fingers into her, teasing her G-spot and pulling out, circling her clit before thrusting in again.
CJ?
She cried out.
I'm...
Her entire body jerked beneath him.
Oh my God!
He pressed his tongue against her clit as she came apart beneath him, her breathing short and erratic. Once she came down from the high of her orgasm, she whispered,
Oh my God. It's been years.
Years? He pulled himself up the length of her body. He could do way better than that. They were just getting started. Then it hit him. Fuck.
What?
Her lids flew open. No fucking condom. He pressed his forehead against hers and gave a muffled laugh, and then he kissed her lips. He expected sympathy for their dilemma, but she laughed hard, dissolving into fits and giggles. What's so damn funny? She pointed at him.
There's a lesson for you. Next time, don't kiss and run.
Kiss and run? He glanced down between her legs. I don't think you can call that kissing and running. Her fingers traced the swell of his muscles.
Not that. What you did earlier.
He tipped his head and vented a deep sigh. His dick ached, and once again he'd go unfulfilled.
Good night. You should get some rest.
She kissed him on the cheek and left him gaping as she rolled to her side. Good night?
Mm-hmm. I should get some sleep.
Another giggle escaped her perfect mouth. He gripped his cock, angry as hell for not being able to claim her the way he wanted, but pleased to have brought her such pleasure. How am I supposed to sleep?
She
said.
Maybe you should make a run to a drugstore before morning. We can try again when the sun comes up, but I think nothing is open this time of night.
He smacked her on the ass. Don't think that I won't. This isn't funny. She turned back over and cracked one eye open.
Call it payback for calling me a drowned rat.
What if I apologize? She eyed his engorged cock.
I'm listening. 28. Bedsheets. Melissa. Melissa twisted in the bedsheets, sleepy and satisfied for more than one reason. As frustrating as the shower had been with the sensual-turned-clinical body wash, she reveled in the languid exhaustion from what had been the best orgasm of her life. Her clit throbbed with the aftershocks of CJ and his amazing tongue. She rolled her eyes back, wanting more of that bliss, more of him. Scott had never taken her to such a soul-shattering height. He met her basic needs, but had never made her fly apart. Scott saw it as a sign of failure if she didn't orgasm during their lovemaking. But those brief twitches, she couldn't call them orgasms, had been tiny blips of sensation, not the toe-curling, eye-rolling, whole-body come-apart orgasm that had been. CJ was definitely not Scott. Her stomach nodded with memories of her ex-husband's touch. His murderous hands traveled her body both before and after his kills. She hadn't known it then, but afterward, those gory memories fueled her nightmares.
Hey.
CJ cupped her chin.
Are you all right?
Her gaze cut to his chiseled body. Broad shoulders, biceps larger around than her legs, and ridges of muscle with V-cut indentations which angled down to the potency of his masculinity. His hardened cock jutted before her, the head weeping with need. Oh, the poor thing. He'd done more than please her. CJ had ended a years-long sexual drought, and she repaid him with thoughts of Scott. With a mental shove, she pushed Scott and her mental baggage to the back of her mind to focus on the man stretched out on her bed. His eyes held such strength, and his arms brought such comfort. She could lose herself in him forever.
Hey,
he said.
Are you going to answer me?
He bent down and brushed her mouth with his lips, the slow, gentle press turning deeper with each pull of his breath. He took. She gave. It felt natural and easy, nothing like the forced intimacy with a stop. She wrapped her arms around CJ's neck and lost herself within his embrace. More of this was what she wanted, and wow, he knew how to kindle a blaze of fevered need. Heated lust spread through her body, and she hungered for more. The need to feel him inside of her, stretching her and filling her up, made her hungry for a lick, a taste, and his touch everywhere. But the lack of a simple piece of latex would keep them apart. The things CJ had done, the way he'd taken control, he allowed her to lose herself in the moment. But that moment was gone with the flight of her thoughts. She'd been selfish, too, leaving him hanging. But what if... She gripped his cock.
Holy fuck.
CJ jumped, and she released him, surprised by his reaction. I'm sorry, I just thought... She thought what, to give a hand job to pay him back? Tit for tat? Did he want that? She had been out of this game for over a decade. The ridiculousness of the situation sank in. She was such an idiot. A soft laugh bubbled up and out. She really was a fool.
What's so funny?
The sternness in CJ's voice turned her giggle into unadulterated laughter. Ouch. Her incisions pinched with pain. Only a twinge, though. She didn't hurt as much as she thought she should. Maybe CJ had magical healing hands? Or perhaps he relaxed her so much that she was beyond feeling pain? You, she pointed at him. You're funny.
Me? What did I do?
Melissa rolled to her side and faced him. She worried her lower lip, biting it to keep another round of laughter from spilling forth. You jumped.
What?
I put my hand on your cock and you practically leaped out of your skin. His brows drew together.
I did no such thing.
He glanced at her, a sheepish expression on his face.
Okay, maybe you startled me.
Melissa cupped her head and leaned on her elbow. Seriously, what kind of man doesn't have a condom stashed in his wallet? He poked her shoulder.
The kind who isn't fucking everything on 2 legs.
He rolled to his back.
It's not like I woke up thinking today's the day I'm getting laid.
She ran her fingers over his abdomen and followed the faint line of hair up to his navel. Slowly, she drew a circle and watched his cock bob. His breathing hitched. The heat of his body radiated in the space between them. She leaned forward and snuggled into the crook of his arm, placing her cheek against his chest. Her fingers wandered, heading down now, retracing her path. She inched closer to the V-cut groove cut into his abdomen and let her fingers find the dips and valleys of his musculature as they arrowed down to his heavy cock. His body shuddered under the assault of her fingers. "You know," she said, "there are other things we can do."
Other things?
His throaty chuckle did things to her insides. Good things. Wonderful things she wanted to explore. Fun things. She stared at her hand, resting against his hip. Did she dare? Scott had always been particular about putting her hands or mouth on that part of him. Making love to his wife didn't involve hand jobs or blow jobs. He saved those for the girls he fucked and then killed. What would CJ think of her lack of oral skills? She felt different with CJ. Bolder, perhaps? More willing? Definitely. Things had never been like this with Scott. She couldn't be thinking about her ex-husband when she was in bed with CJ. "I don't want you to think I'm an ungrateful lover." She cupped his balls, and he rewarded her with a lusty groan.
Your hands are magical things, darling.
She turned her attention to his cock, stroking the long length of him. Her hand barely closed around his girth, which made her worry about what would happen when or if they ever had sex. How much would it hurt? Would he even fit inside?
Don't overthink it.
He wrapped his hand around hers.
Let me show you what I like.
The warmth of his hand folded around hers, his fingers overlapping hers as he showed how he liked to stroke himself. The motion began as a gentle glide, then he fisted his hand around hers, forcing their combined grip harder. Slow turned needful and became relentless as he chased his orgasm and guided her efforts. This was easily the most sensual moment in her life. A hand job turned into an erotic coupling of 2 souls. She wanted to give him more. "CJ," she said, "I want to—" The strain of his breathing surprised her even as his hips rocked against her hand.
So close,
He said.
Don't you dare stop. Your hands feel fucking amazing.
A low groan escaped him as his hips bucked. Her breathing hitched, and the tingle between her legs turned to a needy pulsation. CJ controlled her, showing her how to hold him, stroke him, and draw forth his pleasure. His openness to sex captivated her every breath. Her nipples tightened, his need infectious and overwhelming. But this was his moment. She had her orgasm. Should she hide her reaction? The ache between her legs demanded release. She should straddle his lap and ride him until they were both exhausted. Nope, not until they had a condom. Would CJ allow such a thing? Scott never did. She'd probably fumble and look ridiculous. But this, stroking CJ's cock, she could do. And while Scott never allowed her to go down on him, she understood the mechanics of a blowjob. CJ's eyes pinched shut with his pleasure, breaths billowing out of his lungs with sharp exhalations. She wriggled into a better position, never once letting go of his cock. Not that she could with his fingers fisted around hers. But she leaned over and took the head of his cock in her mouth. The salty tang of him hit the tip of her tongue.
Holy fuck.
CJ stilled.
You should warn a guy.
Does that mean you don't want me to?
Baby, if you're gonna put me in that mouth of yours, holy fuck.
He released the death grip on her hand, and with a sly smile, he laced his fingers behind his head.
I'm officially at your mercy.
My mercy. He closed his eyes. When she didn't move, he opened one eye and peeked at her.
Are you going to make me beg?
I should, she said with a half-hearted laugh. But she had no intention of making him beg. This was a gift she intended to give. But since you saved my life, I'll spare you the begging.
Good.
He said with relief.
But damn it, woman, a man can only take so much.
Melissa bent again and stared at his cock. It was a natural reaction to kiss the crown and lick the slit. CJ groaned and his body shivered. She opened her mouth and curled her lips over her teeth. Very few men enjoyed the scrape, or so she'd heard. But he was so big. Hopefully he'd forgive a little teeth. Instead of taking him in her mouth, she took him from the side, sliding her tongue over his ropey veins and tracing their path with short flicks of her tongue. CJ squirmed beneath her, his moans deepening, becoming guttural and needful. She lost herself in the joy of pleasing him and went to work. There was no way she'd fit all of him in her mouth. She fisted the base of his shaft, applying the same amount of pressure he'd shown her during the hand job, and then she slid her mouth over the tip of his cock. His moans and sighs told her she wasn't doing a bad job, but whether she was doing a good job remained to be seen. Each lick and sweep of her tongue brought forth more moans. She had a man's cock in her mouth, and as far as she could tell, he loved it. Now, how to bring this home? She did her best to take him, fighting against her gag reflex. It took time to find a rhythm, but she learned how to coordinate her hand and mouth. The corners of her mouth hurt from stretching around his girth, and the muscles of her jaw ached. Dear Lord, was she going to get a cramp in her jaw? That thought had her giggling.
Holy fuck, what was that?
Oh, shit.
Do that again.
The husky drawl of his voice surprised her. His accent was sexy, but with his need laced through it, his voice turned combustible. Her clit throbbed in response, needing something, anything, wanting him. The head of his cock pulsed with each flick of her tongue. She couldn't wait to feel him stretching her wide and taking her fully. Damn condom. She hit a spot on CJ's cock and made him jerk. A strangled cry erupted from his throat, and his fingers dug into her hair. Guess he was done being hands-off. She stroked the same spot again. His hips bucked, and his fingers dug into her scalp. No longer in control, he set the pace. It was all she could do to keep her mouth open and her hand clamped around his shaft. If it weren't for her hand, he'd be choking her with every thrust.
More.
He growled.
Deeper.
His command had her somehow taking him deeper while he guided her head. She squeezed her eyes shut and fought her gag reflex, desperate to make this as good for him as she could. He dug his fingernails into her scalp and moved her head according to his demanding rhythm. And then he cried out. His hips thrust upward and he pushed her head down, burying himself as deep as possible. The tip of his cock hit the back of her throat, and then she felt his orgasm roll through his body, unstoppable and full of potent fury. His hips bucked as she fought for air. His moans filled the darkness as he spent his need and then stilled. Then he removed his hands from her hair as she licked his shaft. Melissa collapsed beside him and snuggled into the crook of his arm. She liked this spot. Was that as good for you as it was for me? She couldn't help the snarky comment. His deep, throaty laughter filled the room.
I'd say we're even. Just wait until I buy that box of condoms.
What if I'm not interested?
Darling, you and I both know you're dying to find out what happens next.
A rumble of laughter swept through his chest, the deep vibrations fluttering against her cheek. She stilled at those words and then gasped when CJ rolled her to her back and spread her legs. He grinned.
Time for round 2.
Her back arched, and her eyes rolled as the tip of his tongue stroked her clit.
29. A Prince's Work. Pierce. My princesses whimpered in their cages. Even our fairy godmother gaped, her eyes wide with unasked questions as I dragged the unconscious man across the floor. Her training, while slow, continued in the proper direction. Compliance was a skill she learned quickly, and she was keen to please me now that the others would suffer for her indiscretions. She had finally found her maternal instinct. The nurse was an armful, a bastard with a mean left hook. My left eye had swollen shut until I could barely see out of it, and I couldn't wait to get upstairs to ice it down. I had given considerable thought to my preparations, but getting him home had been even more difficult than I'd expected. He headed straight to a bar after his shift. I wandered in a few moments later and slipped something into his drink. He could barely walk to my van, but was aware enough to haul off and punch me when he saw what waited for him inside. The leather, chains, and the duct tape were dead giveaways, and although he'd fought, he'd been in no condition to win. My eye was an unfortunate casualty, something I would take out on him at a later date. I pressed a rag saturated in chloroform over his face, and that had been the end of his fight. The rope and duct tape secured him and took his fists out of the picture. It nearly broke my back, half carrying, half dragging him downstairs and through the tunnel to my dungeon. My attention shifted to Gretel, and I bit my lower lip with worry. Blood soaked through her bandages again. When I called her, she didn't answer. Not because she was disrespectful, but because she was unconscious. Had she lost too much blood? Once I had Dickwad secured, I would check on her. If she were seriously hurt, I'd never forgive myself. Dickwad was bigger than I remembered, and I was concerned the chloroform would wear off before I had him secured. I struggled to work quickly. "Cinderella, how's my girl?"
My prince, I am well.
Her sultry voice echoed from her cage, but she didn't come forward to greet me. I sensed fear in her voice, and I was not pleased. "Come into the light so I can see you," I ordered. She shuffled forward, and I glanced at the bandages over the X I cut between her breasts. Red saturated the material. Her bandages needed to be changed as well. "Good girl," I said. "Tell me about Gretel." Cinderella hung her head in a proper submissive pose. She clasped her hands in front of her, making sure they didn't obscure my view of the triangle of blonde hair between her legs.
My prince, Gretel has not spoken for some time.
I dragged my unconscious helper to the wall and chained him there. A steady pulse thumped under my finger when I held it to his neck. Slow, rhythmic breathing told me he was still out, but I didn't trust him. I leaned my elbow against his sternum and gave a deep rub sufficient to wake the dead. He responded with a moan. Satisfied he wouldn't revive any time too soon, I left him against the wall to check on Gretel. She looked so pale, but her breathing was steady. Her pulse fluttered in her throat. At least she had a pulse, but it was way too fast. Looking at the amount of blood she lost, it wouldn't be long before her pulse turned thready and weak or stopped altogether. I had at most a few hours left, and I needed Dickwad to get her bleeding under control. I slapped her face, but got no response. I hit again, and her head flopped. When I nudged her with the toe of my boot, she gave me nothing. Satisfied she wasn't ignoring me on purpose, I squatted down to get eye to eye with her. She breathed with a gentle rise and fall of her chest. Blood soaked through the bandage, covering the large X carved between her breasts. I yanked it off to examine the cut beneath. The gaping wound entranced me. The congealed blood accentuated the sharp surgical cuts. I couldn't wait to see the scar left behind after she healed. Dickwad groaned against the wall and startled me. That pissed me off. My reaction revealed weakness and hinted at the tiniest thread of fear lodged deep within me. This was the first time I had another male in my dungeon. Drugged or not, he posed a threat until I disposed of him. Gathering the supplies needed, I wrapped the man in thick leather belts and bound him with chains. Every restraint was tripled for redundancy, and I placed locks on each chain. The biggest problem I faced was how to handle his hands. He needed to tend to Gretel, but how much slack should I allow? If he got loose, I wasn't afraid he'd escape my dungeon. I was worried about what would happen if I had to fight him down here. Best case, I killed him, but he'd been hard to take down while drugged, thus the black eye. And that was after I'd drugged him. If we got into it down here, He wouldn't be under the influence of a drug, and any fight would put my princesses in danger. I couldn't have that. Locked in their cages, the chances of them getting injured would be small, but I didn't like the thought of violence around them. Worst case, he overwhelmed me. Things would turn bad for everyone because the motherfucker would have to kill me. They'd all die because there was no way any of them were getting past the locks, and none of my girls knew about the back door I'd built down here. Even if they found it, they'd have to contend with the locks. After much fiddling, I finally had him how I wanted. The belts and chains crisscrossed his chest, and pulleys strung him up like a puppet. Leather encased his legs, and a web of chains and ropes secured him to the wall and the support beams overhead. Locks glittered in the light, tying everything in place. When he tended to Gretel, I would bring her to him with whatever supplies he required and lay them all out. Then I would step a safe distance away and release the chains holding his arms with the pulleys overhead. He'd be free to move hands and arms, nothing else. And when he was done, I would string him back up. I watched Dick Wad with a wary eye. Sharing had never been one of my strengths, and I hated to share even this little bit of my private world with him. I despised him for the intrusion. Less than a half an hour later, his moans turned more purposeful. Soon he would wake. I went to the closet and pulled out gowns for my princesses, folding them with care over my arm. My princesses looked lovely in their garments, and while he was here they would be covered. All except Gretel and Cinderella. That could not be avoided. As I passed out the dresses, I stopped by each of the cages to reassure them. Red Riding Hood crawled to me. She dared not look at me. We'd had to repeat a lesson last week, and she still bore the marks from her punishment. I reached through the bar and tangled my fingers in her raven locks. "How is my princess?"
"I am well, my prince. May I serve you?"
The change in her attitude had been a pleasure to behold since her punishment. My dick twitched with arousal, but I was too wary of my unwanted guest tied to the wall. I handed her the dress. "Put on your dress, Red. You can please me another day." She bowed her head and took the gown. Next, Sleeping Beauty crawled to the front of her cage. Perhaps the most intelligent of my princesses, she rarely required punishment. Gracefully, she knelt with her head on her hands in supplication. She never spoke unless I addressed her directly. I loved that about her. I handed over her dress. "Get dressed, Beauty."
"Yes, my prince."
Red welts crisscrossed her back. I'd had fun with the whip this morning. The deep bruise over her kidney had yet to fade, though. I twisted my lips and wondered if I shouldn't have Dick Wad take a look at that. Goldilocks greeted me with much the same as the others and stretched out her hand to retrieve her dress. I moved to Cinderella's cage. She watched me warily with wide, expressionless eyes. She endured such pain for me, which made me proud. I knelt in front of her cage, and she shuffled forward to press her forehead against the bars. "You do not get a dress. I want him to check your cuts. Belle, my beautiful Belle, my first, and the only one I ever allowed unchained while out of her cage, waited for me. She didn't kneel like the others, but rather prostrated herself on the floor. I smiled at her display. "Belle, what do you want?"
"Whatever pleases you, master."
She was the only one who ever called me master. I would die for Belle. It would please me if you got up. She jumped to her feet and gave a smile as her eyes flicked to mine. She wasn't permitted to look me in the eye. It would earn her a caning. That was the stated price when any of the princesses dared to look upon me without permission. I shook my head, playing her game, relishing the thought of welting her perfect ass and then fucking it until I passed out. I wagged my finger and clucked my tongue. "Belle, you are a naughty princess." Her look of contrition was anything but repentant. My dick swelled with arousal. I could not ignore my need much longer. Her eyes cut to my crotch, and she swept her tongue over her lower lip. I was tempted to let her bring me relief, but I had a much better idea. Put on your dress, Belle. I'll cane you later. For now, your punishment is to watch your fairy godmother please me." Belle snatched her dress out of my hand.
"She doesn't know what you like, master."
"No, she does not, which is why she must learn." I would never tell Belle our fairy godmother surpassed Belle's oral skills. In the corner cage, our fairy godmother hunched her shoulders. She learned her lesson and would do whatever I wanted. I released the button on my jeans, loving the wide-eyed expression on her face. I gestured for her to take to her knees. There was a look of utter disgust on her face as she approached the front of her cage. I would attend to that bad habit soon. Reaching through the bars, I secured a chain to her collar, and then I tugged her close. It took but a second to free my cock. I stood outside the bars, shoving my cock through the gap and into the heat of her mouth. Her velvety, soft lips wrapped around me. I had a momentary hesitation about her teeth. Still, I was confident she understood the price of failure after watching me with the knives. A deep voice, groggy with the after effects of the drugs, cried out, "What the fuck?" I rocked my hips into Henrietta's face, enjoying the sensations she pulled from my body. You motherfucking bastard." Chains rattled and held firm as Dickwad tested the strength of his bonds. I had no concerns about him getting free. I'd been careful and checked everything 6 times. "You sick fuck. What the fuck have you done?" His words rang in my ears, speeding me toward release. The rising panic in his voice added a delicious counterpoint to the soft pulls of Henrietta's mouth. Her dead husband trained her well.
30. Good morning. Melissa. Melissa woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of the hotel room. Dust motes danced in the room, drifting on the lazy currents of air. The bed covers twisted around her legs, trapping her in their tangled web. Her side ached. The healing muscles complained each time she moved. It had taken every ounce of self-control not to flinch when CJ's hands had roamed her bruises. But every other inch had been pure pleasure. She stretched out, disappointed to feel the other side of the bed empty. No CJ. She rose to her elbows, her mind not thinking so much about CJ, but what the rest of the day would bring. Detectives would come, questions would be asked. She'd be forced to deal with the reality Scott was out there. He'd keep killing until she came to him, or until he took her back. Either option sent shudders trembling down her spine. A soft knock pulled her from her morbid thoughts.
"Melissa, are you awake?"
She loved the rough timbre of CJ's voice. He had one of those deep male voices that captured attention. But then there were moments, such as now, when the tenderness within him shone through. Her heart softened, listening to that voice. Brushing back the hair from her face, she scooted to a sitting position, pleased to find she didn't hurt as much as she had the night before. She cleared her throat. "I'm awake." He pushed open the door to her room. The white terry cloth robe clung to his amazing frame, and he held a bundle of clothing in his hand. Her mouth watered at the sight of him, and her eyes dipped down to the belt of his robe.
"Do you mind if I use the bathroom?"
Fine lines marred his face. She waved him through. "No, please, go ahead." He headed to the bathroom without another word, giving the bed a wide berth. He was out in less than 5 minutes, dressed in the clothes he'd worn the night before.
"Bathroom's yours."
He gave a wink, and her belly flip-flopped. "How did you sleep? You look horrible." His eyes narrowed.
For someone who claims to be upset by my compliments, you don't hand them out very well yourself.
Melissa couldn't help but roll her eyes. "Sorry, but you look like hell."
I didn't sleep well.
"Why didn't you sleep in the bed?" He took a step toward her, heat smoldering in his gaze.
I considered it.
"You should have joined me. Maybe then you would have slept better." As bold as her words were, she still pulled the covers high on her chest. He snickered.
The thought crossed my mind several times.
She bit her lower lip. "Then why didn't you?"
I tried.
"No, you didn't."
Yes, I did.
I waited.
You fell asleep.
The second orgasm had been more intense than the first. Heat bloomed in her cheeks, and she was helpless to stop the flush she was certain betrayed her embarrassment. The smirk on his face told her how much he enjoyed making her blush. CJ sat at the edge of the bed. They stared at each other across the distance. He touched her leg, and burning contact was reestablished. Her chest did that flutter thing when the desire in his eyes couldn't be ignored. She wanted him to kiss her, but he didn't, and she was too hesitant to take the initiative. Instead, he spoke in a teasing tone.
I left to make a few calls. When I returned, you were snoring.
Snoring? I don't snore. A smile lit his face, erasing the lines of fatigue she had seen earlier. The sunlight streaming through the windows twinkled in his eyes.
Snoring and drooling.
He winked. She threw a pillow at him, but he blocked it, sending it tumbling to the ground. He scooted closer, close enough for a kiss, but only stared in her eyes. Did you go shopping last night? She couldn't come straight out and ask if he'd bought condoms. While eager to explore more with him, she didn't want to appear desperate.
We'll get there, darling. There's no rush.
He leaned in, and their lips collided. Soft and gentle. He brushed his lips against hers, his tongue teasing her mouth open before he delved inside to tangle tongues. He ended the kiss long before she was ready.
I'm sorry,
He said.
but I have to leave for a bit.
She placed a hand on his arm. Why? What happened? He shook his head.
Nothing happened. I asked Mac to pick up my things at my hotel, but he's busy with Jenny. I need to check out my hotel and bring my things here, maybe buy those condoms while I'm out.
He winked and pressed her nose with the pad of his thumb.
I'll be back in less than an hour.
Okay.
This is important. Your security detail isn't here yet, but hotel security knows what's up. They're watching through the security cameras, but there's no one posted outside the door. Lock the door behind me. Let no one in. You understand?
She nodded. Lock the door and let no one inside. Don't worry, I know what to do. She'd feel safer if he wasn't leaving, but the hotel had decent security. He pointed to the bathroom.
No showers until I get back.
I feel 1,000 times better. I can manage a shower by myself. Although, if you'd like to redeem your nunnish ways...
I'd love nothing better.
He breathed out a sigh.
But I have to go. I'd feel better if you didn't shower while I'm gone. I don't want to worry about you falling.
Fine, she said. No showers. CJ rose and tugged at the bottom of his shirt, straightening it.
If anyone, and I mean anyone but me, Mac, or Jenny tries to get in, you call 911. Then you get inside the bathroom and prop a chair under the doorknob.
He's not going to come after me here. Scott's too smart for that.
Better to be cautious.
CJ kissed her again, but broke it off before the kiss became too intimate. He showed her how to brace the door with a chair. His caution made her wonder what he did for a living. Still, a little paranoia was probably a good thing when a person had a serial killer ex-husband out to get them. She kissed him goodbye, a much more affectionate and satisfying embrace than their first kiss. He copped a feel of her breasts, and his smirk promised more later. She locked the room after he left, but she wasn't going to listen to all his rules. She was dying for a shower. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of Rescuing Melissa, the Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1. Written by Ellie Masters. Narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes.
Hello, this is Ellie Masters, and I hope you're enjoying this free audio exclusive of Rescuing Melissa, the first book in my Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialist series. It's a spine-tingling thriller and steamy romance all rolled into one. I like to think of it as Romantic Suspense meets Silence of the Lambs. Chapters 1 through 30 are now out and ready to binge, and new chapters are on the way each week. There are 65 altogether. Make sure you don't miss out on the rest of Rescuing Melissa. Like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to tap the bell to be notified when new chapters are posted for your audio listening enjoyment. By the end of Chapter 30, we know several things. As heat builds between CJ and Melissa, they are now aware Scott Patterson escaped from prison and is desperate to reclaim his wife. We also see Pierce's sanity unraveling, as if he was ever sane to begin with. But he injured Gretel, one of his princesses, and kidnapped Melissa's nurse to help put Gretel back together again. He's never had another man down in his dungeon, and that's making him twitchy. Pierce is also acutely aware that his idol, Scott Patterson, is alive. It will be interesting when Pierce and Scott finally meet in the flesh. If you're enjoying the story, please share with your reading buddies, and let me know what you think in the comments. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. And while waiting for more, you can check me out at elliemasters.com, and you can find all my books at elliemasters.com/Amazon. If you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber, you can read all my books for free. Until next time, this is Ellie Masters bringing you the best of romantic suspense. Goodbye.